Abschlussvortrag der Ulmer Denkanstöße für das Jahr 2022 und starten, bevor Sie den Vortrag von Frau Howe hören, der sicherlich durch unsere Moderatorin auch nochmal anmoderiert wird, wollen wir wie in jedem Jahr noch eine Spendenübergabe machen. Wir sammeln von Seiten der Ulmer Denkanstöße ja in jedem Jahr für ein gemeinnütziges Projekt Gelder, weil wir erfreulicherweise durch die Unterstützung der Sparda Bank Baden-Württemberg, der Universität und der Stadt Ulm diese Denkanstöße eintrittsfrei gestalten können und Sie immer um Spenden bitten, wenn Sie dann eben doch der Meinung sind, Sie haben hier was mitgenommen oder Sie möchten einfach ein entsprechend gutes Projekt unterstützen. In diesem Jahr geht die Unterstützung an die Ulmer Schatzkiste und ich darf ganz herzlich begrüßen und auf die Bühne bitten, die beiden Vertreter, Herr Hönig und den Namen von Ihnen weiß Frau Krämer. Herzlich willkommen. Die Kollegen der Ulmer Schatzkiste haben in den letzten Tagen sehr, sehr engagiert und auch erfolgreich hier Geld eingesammelt. Und ich danke ganz, ganz herzlich all denjenigen, die gespendet haben, entweder hier direkt ins Spendenkästchen oder auch übers Netz. Das hat in diesem Jahr erfreulicherweise viel besser geklappt als im letzten Jahr. Da merkt man, wir alle sind doch ein bisschen routinierter geworden bei diesen digitalen Möglichkeiten. Und ich bitte außerdem auf die Bühne Frau Klausnitzer, Bereichsleiterin der Sparda Bank. Denn sie ist diejenige, die sozusagen direkt mit einem großen Scheck hier hantieren kann und darf. Und die ganz besonders gute Nachricht ist, die Sparda Bank Baden-Württemberg verdoppelt jeden gespendeten Euro, auch in diesem Jahr wie jedes Jahr. Dafür wirklich ganz, ganz herzlichen Dank Ihnen, Frau Klausnitzer. So, jetzt würde ich sagen, wir machen es noch ein bisschen spannend, oder? Und lassen der Kollegin und dem Kollegen von der Ulmer Schatzkiste noch einmal kurz die Bühne, dass sie vielleicht noch ein paar Sätze zum Projekt sagen. Einverstanden? Jetzt muss ich schnell schauen, ob wir noch ein neues Mikro haben.
Magst du?
Ich fange an. Einfach reinreden? Also zuerst mal herzlichen Dank. Ja, also wir sind total... So? Ja. Vielen Dank für die Möglichkeit, ja, uns vorstellen zu dürfen. Vielen Dank für die Möglichkeit, Spenden zu sammeln und vielen Dank für die tolle Unterstützung. Wir hatten unglaublich viel Spaß. Okay, und über das Projekt haben Sie ja schon viel gehört in den letzten Tagen. Unsere Zielgruppe sind Eltern minderjähriger Kinder mit einer Krebserkrankung, mit einer unheilbaren Krebserkrankung. Und wir möchten Ihnen die Möglichkeit bieten, mit unserer Hilfe einen Film zu drehen, einen autobiografischen Film mit Botschaften, mit Geschichten für Ihre Kinder als Hinterlassenschaft. Magst du?
Ja, jetzt haben Sie eigentlich im Wesentlichen alle schon gehört, was wichtig ist. Es gibt aber einen spannenden Bezug zur Veranstaltung hier. Der Hintergrund unseres Projekts hat mit Werten zu tun. Und wir kennen aus unserer Arbeit mit schwer krebskranken Menschen die Situation, dass der Blick ans Lebensende uns oft ermöglicht, wieder zu erkennen, was uns eigentlich wirklich wichtig ist, was unsere Werte sind, was unsere Bedürfnisse sind. Und nur wenn wir die kennen, ist eine würdeerhaltende Behandlung bis zum Lebensende möglich. Und diese Idee hat uns motiviert, quasi Menschen einerseits darin zu unterstützen, dorthin zu gucken und dann das, was sie sehen, zu nutzen, um das quasi an ihre Angehörigen weiterzugeben. Ich denke, das ist so ein bisschen, ein ganz kurzer Abriss, was der psychologische Hintergrund wäre davon.
Vielen herzlichen Dank. Dann übergebe ich das Wort an Frau Klausnitzer.
Ja, gerne. Spannend. Versprochen ist versprochen. Herr Hettich hat es am Donnerstagabend versprochen, wir verdoppeln. Und jetzt wollen wir natürlich alle wissen, was an Summe zusammengekommen ist. Und es sind insgesamt 5.000 Euro, die wir spenden können.
Ja, danke schön.
Ja, wir machen das gerne als Sparda Bank und besuchen Sie doch uns mal in der Filiale Ulm am Salzstadel Parkhaus. Da lassen Sie sich doch bitte mal informieren, weil Sie können mit ganz, ganz kleinen Beträgen richtig viel Gutes tun. Wir unterstützen sehr gern regional. Vielen Dank.
Danke.
Ja. Ja, 3 Leute ohne Maske ist schon okay. Ja, brauchen wir ein bisschen. Okay. Gut, wunderbar. Wunderbar. Also dann Ihnen toi 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 für die weitere Arbeit. Das ist wirklich ein ganz großes Geschenk, glaube ich, an die Betroffenen und wir freuen uns sehr, dass Sie diese Idee umsetzen. Dankeschön.
Danke.
So, jetzt darf ich auf die Bühne bitten, unseren langjährigen Projektpartner, den geschäftsführenden Vorstand der Sparda-Bank Baden-Württemberg. Herzlich willkommen, Herr Hettich, hier auf der Bühne. Wir beide haben heute noch eine Mission zu erfüllen. Und dazu brauchen wir Frau Professor Bräuninger. Bitte schön.
Ja, wir hätten Sie gerne in unserer Mitte, liebe Frau Professor Bräuninger. Denn Ulmer Denkanstöße sind auch im Wandel. Das passt ein Stück weit zu diesem Wochenende hier. Aber kein Widerstand, sondern nur Wandel. Ne? Wir haben vor 15 Jahren, eigentlich waren es dann wahrscheinlich 17 Jahre, weil vor 15 Jahren war es das erste Mal und insofern waren es wahrscheinlich 17 Jahre, als wir uns gefunden haben. Wir heißt das Humboldt-Studienzentrum, die Sparda-Bank Baden-Württemberg, liebe Frau Mann, die Stadt Ulm, um die Ulmer Denkanstöße beginnen zu lassen. Und heute haben wir den Wandel, Frau Professor Dr. Bräuninger, dass wir zwei uns in der Funktion nicht wiedersehen, nämlich als gemeinsame Veranstalter. Und ich möchte Ihnen ganz, ganz, ganz herzlich im Namen des Publikums, aller Zuschauer draußen, aller Besucher über die 15 Jahre hinweg Dankeschön sagen. Weil Ihnen ist es fantastisch gelungen, diese Idee, Zeitgeschehen für Menschen sichtbar zu machen, erlebbar zu machen, in Diskurse zu bringen. Sie haben das immer wunderbar geschafft, es auf den Punkt zu bringen. Die Überschrift hat immer zur aktuellen Zeit gepasst, auch wenn das Unglück in der Ukraine jetzt vielleicht nicht sein müsste, aber es ist wunderbar, wie Sie das immer hinbekommen haben. Und was ich über die Zeit gelernt habe, ist, dass Enthusiasmus keine Grenzen hat, dass Begeisterung keine Grenzen hat, dass Umtriebigkeit keine Grenzen hat, denn Sie haben das alle 3 Dinge immer so gelebt, dass ich jedes Mal begeistert, entweder von der Veranstaltung, in den Vorplanungsgesprächen, ich bin immer begeistert von Ulm nach Stuttgart zurückgefahren und habe mir immer gesagt, nach Ulm muss ich auf jeden Fall wieder fahren, deswegen bin ich heute hier am letzten offiziellen Tag. Sie sind künftig Ehrengast, das versteht sich von selber, denn ohne Sie wären die Ulmer Denkanstöße nie zustande gekommen. Herzlichen Dank und wenn ich richtig informiert bin, habe ich noch einen Blumenstrauß für Sie.
Vielen, vielen Dank, Herr Hettich. Also, oh, das ist ja wunderschön. Danke, danke. Danke. Ganz, ganz herzlichen Dank. Also Herr Hettich, vor allem, dass Sie jetzt extra gekommen sind am Wochenende und also es rührt mich ganz. Vielen, vielen Dank und auch Ihnen, Frau Mann, vielen Dank. Wir hatten ja angefangen vor vielen Jahren und es war ja eigentlich die Sparda-Bank, die alles initiiert hat. Und es fing ja an, dass jemand von Ihnen bei unserem Präsidenten war und der mir die Visitenkarte gab und sagte, machen Sie was draus, machen Sie was Ordentliches draus, meinen Frieden haben Sie. Und dann ging ich zur Sparda-Bank und die einzige Bedingung war mit der Stadt. Und Frau Mann war da auch schon. Und dann sind wir eigentlich im Laufe der Zeit so toll zusammengewachsen. Es war also einmalig, es hätte eigentlich nicht besser sein können. Und wir hatten eigentlich bei allen Sachen immer wie so einen kleinen Algorithmus im Kopf. Bei allen Überlegungen könnte es was für die Denkanstöße sein. Wir hatten so ein seismografisches Gespür entwickelt. Und dann hat Frau Mann wieder was gehabt, die Stadt Ulm, Frau Schwarzenberg, Herr Huber. Und zwar immer wieder haben wir dann zu dritt, und die Sparta-Bank hat sich ja auch so eingebracht, also dass es irgendwie am Ende so war, als ob wir immer so einen kleinen Stein ins Wasser werfen und dann kommen Kreise und die Leute haben dann Interesse gefunden und wir konnten immer irgendwas bewegen und es war wunderbar. Und ich habe auch immer so ein Glück gehabt, das möchte ich hier auch nochmal sagen, mit meiner Frau Meyer-Quintus und jetzt heute mit den Studenten, mit der Frau Lahmann und dem Herrn Breitinger. Wir waren ja so eine kleine Frauschaft. Wir sind da an der Uni im Humboldt-Zentrum nur zu zweit eigentlich. Frau Springer haben wir noch in der Jaremko und unsere Studenten, und da haben wir es einfach wunderschön gehabt und also es hätte nicht besser sein können, da unser Team. Gell? Also Frau Mann, Ihnen auch noch von Herzen Dank. Es war einmalig, wie wir das immer alles zusammen gewuppt haben und gestemmt haben. Und da hätte ich herzlichen Dank. Also ihr seid ja wirklich die Initiatoren, ihr habt ja alles.
Ja, im Grunde war es ja so, die Universität wollte nur eine Anzeige für eine Festschrift und wir haben gesagt, eine Anzeige für eine Festschrift ist uns zu wenig und Sie haben das aufgegriffen, haben was draus gemacht und wir versprechen Ihnen, es geht weiter.
Wunderbar.
Und ich freue mich natürlich, dass es Ihnen dann auch gut geht, wünsche Ihnen Gesundheit, alles, was Sie sich vorgenommen haben, dass es in Erfüllung geht, auch in der nachaktiven Zeit. So wie ich Sie kennengelernt habe, wird die auch nicht ruhig sein, sondern wird weiterhin Umtrieb sein. Und ich freue mich sehr, Sie dann als Gast begrüßen zu können. Und da kann man ja dann ganz entspannt kommen und die Ulmer Denkanstöße genießen. In diesem Sinne alles erdenklich Gute.
Ganz, ganz herzlichen Dank, Herr Heike. Vielen, vielen Dank. Danke. Ganz herzlichen Dank. Vielen, vielen Dank. Es ist ja total lieb, dass Sie extra gekommen sind. Danke. Vielen, vielen Dank.
Das letzte Mal organisiert von Frau Professor Bräuninger, aber es gibt auch eine Premiere bei diesem letzten Mal von ihr organisiert, bei diesen 15. Denkanstößen, nämlich ein Vortrag auf Englisch. Freuen Sie sich auf die führende Changemakerin, wenn man so sagen kann, aus Großbritannien, Wandelmensch Sophie Howe, die weltweit einzige Kommissarin für zukünftige Generationen. Die streitet sozusagen in der Regierung von Wales für das Recht der Ungeborenen, also für die, die jetzt noch gar nicht geboren sind. Laut Tageszeitung The Guardian eben die erste Ministerin der Ungeborenen seit 2016. Sie bewertet die großen Projekte der Regierung von Bildung über Verkehr und berät auch öffentliche Stellen, dass sie eben an die zukünftigen Generationen denken. Und es gibt dazu auch direkt ein Gesetz in Wales, das Gesetz zum Wohlbefinden zukünftiger Generationen. Zuvor hat sie sich am Gesetz zur Bekämpfung von Gewalt gegen Frauen und Mädchen beteiligt und ganz jung, mit 21, war sie schon Stadträtin. Ihr beruflicher Hintergrund ist Gleichstellung und Vielfalt. Sie zählt zu den Top 100 Business Women in Wales und sie hat 5 Kinder und ist heute aus Cardiff zu uns gekommen. Welcome, Sophie Howe.
Guten Abend, Noswetha, good evening. It's my absolute pleasure to be here with you this evening to talk about the groundbreaking work that we're doing in Wales and to share some of our experiences in legislating to protect the interests of future generations. So, what are we doing right now that in 50 years' time will be seen as a tragedy? What are we doing that future generations will say, what on earth were they thinking? What are we doing that makes us bad ancestors to those who are yet to be born? And we once marvelled at the introduction of mass-produced cars, opening travel up to thousands of people in the Western world. And of course, having a car was seen as the ultimate status symbol. And indeed, the type of car you have is still seen as such. A nod, perhaps, to our ongoing obsession with things. An obsession that has led us to consume vastly more than our fair share of resources. An obsession which is now fundamentally requiring us to change in order to secure for our very existence. And the juxtaposition now of cars drowning in the very streets they have polluted for so long means that the effects of our addiction to carbon are becoming difficult to ignore, even for our most ardent climate deniers. And increasingly, leaders in business and public policy are recognising that business as usual is no longer an option. And citizens themselves, especially our younger generations, are making changes to reduce meat consumption, ditch their cars, refusing and reusing, even instead of recycling. But are we changing fast enough? Is it enough that our young people have an acute sense of the emergency, about securing their futures? When my generation, many of your generations, the ones in fact who mostly still hold the power, still universally continue to act in the short term, from one 5 or 4 year political cycle to the next, instead of having an eye to one generation to the next. And what are the long-term consequences of a globally short-term system of governance? Well, if we look 100,000 years to the past, there have been about 100 billion people who were alive and are now dead. If we look at the moment, there's about 7.7 billion or 7 odd billion people alive on this planet. But if we look to the future, 100,000 years to the future, based on current population statistics, then there's about 6.75 trillion people who are yet to be born. And the decisions that we take today, the things that we do, will fundamentally impact on the lives that those 6.75 trillion live, or indeed whether they live lives at all. Now, when you do a job like mine, you meet lots of interesting people, but I would suggest that you mentally and emotionally brace yourselves if you come across the existential threat people before you enter their world, or indeed lack of world, if you subscribe to their analysis. And Oxford professor Toby Ord suggests actually that we have a 1 in 6 chance of not existing beyond the end of this century. Now, I get that that's difficult to hear and that politicians have enough on their plate at the moment, certainly, coming out of the pandemic, into serious conflict, huge domestic problems for their citizens through crippling rises in the cost of living. But seriously, should any of this be a surprise to us? And for the last few years, we've been hit by what are known as black swan events. Excuse me. These are events that come out of the blue, apparently, events that perhaps we've not been able to predict. But really, is that the case? Many of these events are actually entirely predictable. In terms of the pandemic, the one that's turned our world on its head for the last 2 years, here it is. Here's the risk register, one of the global risk registers, the risk of a pandemic in the top 10 of the global risks. The information is there to allow us to look into and prepare for a possible future. And of course, climate change is featured in the top global risks by likelihood for the last 10 years. And yet we're still not doing anywhere near enough to mitigate this risk globally. And so we act surprised when we find ourselves in a pandemic or in a climate crisis, and yet there it is, predicting this, telling us that there's this risk that exists. And even the Simpsons predicted the risks that we're now seeing. So we have to wake up to the evidence. The science calls for action. And that has been right under our noses for decades. And the pandemic has shown us what can happen when we fail to think ahead. So when will we act on climate change? When it's too late? When more lives are lost? We're still investing in fossil fuels, failing to decarbonise our healthcare systems, putting money before well-being, and still living in the fantasy that everything else will work out in the end, despite us hurtling towards a fairly dystopian reality. And currently we're trying to look to the long term in a short-term world. We're obsessed with fast food, fast cars, fast fashion. We need more allies who will make the brave decisions to see the present and the future as coexisting, as interlinked. Only then can we change our culture to a world of long-termism. So if we're hardwired to hide ourselves away from the future, then we need something that forces us to look to the future. We need a small but clever and progressive nation to come up with a framework to force our systems to think to the future, a framework that not only asks us to look to long term, but legally requires us to do so. And more about that in a moment. But actually, there is a brain science behind why we continue to act in the short term. Studies suggest that when you imagine your future self, your brain starts acting as if you're thinking about a completely different person. So here's how it works. Typically, when you think about yourself, a region of the brain known as the medial prefrontal cortex powers up. And when you think about other people, it powers down. And if you feel like you don't have anything in common with people you're thinking about, then this area of your brain activates even less. However, it's now being found that the further out in time you try to imagine your own life, the less activation you show in this part of the brain. In other words, your brain acts as if your future self is someone you don't know very well, and frankly, someone that you don't particularly care about. It makes sense, right? So it's why we're so bad at planning for retirement. It's why, back to Homer and the Simpsons again, we might have that extra donut or the extra glass of wine before bed, although we know that's not good for our long-term health, but we ignore it. And indeed, I think it explains why many of the world's problems exist at the moment. It's why we're less concerned with people who are remote to us, those whose lives are lived on the other side of the world, those for whom poverty, destitution, early death could be solved with concerted effort from this side of the world. But it's also true for how we think about future generations. And philosopher Roman Gnarek describes us as having colonized the future. Future generations are off in some distant colony that doesn't connect to us, and so therefore we don't need to think about them. And our systems and our structures, our established systems of governance do very little to address this beyond annual budget cycles for our public services are rare. Certainly in the UK during austerity, cuts have fallen on the vast number of services which are actually designed to prevent poverty and ill health. And that's before you even get to assessing future trend scenarios and potential threats. And in fact, Toby Ord explained last week in an event that I did with him that globally we spend more on ice cream than governments spend on foresighting and understanding future trends and threats. And often it's not even about preparing for possible futures. We're not even prepared for highly probable futures. And if you look at some of these headlines, for example, a care crisis, an ageing population and the challenge of meeting care needs for those ageing populations, the changing nature of work, increases in the gig economy and a welfare system whose safety nets do not account for all of this, the ethics of AI. We don't tend to be effective at considering these possible or probable futures when we're planning and designing policy. And therefore, by the time we've implemented policies to solve today's problems, we will need to start again to deal with tomorrow's. And because we don't look to the long term, we're also really bad at taking the action needed to prevent problems happening. So on our trajectory of aging, for example, it could be one of high numbers and high care needs as a result of poor food, poor choices, lack of physical exercise, a failure to recognise the cost of loneliness and isolation to people's long-term health. Or it could be one which we get up front of this, we start taking actions in those areas, in the areas that keep people well in the first place. And then we have an older population who can, as perhaps Mr. Spock of Star Trek fame said, an ageing population that lives long and prospers. To do this, however, we must look beyond the immediate and look at the root causes of issues to find real solutions. For example, understanding why we have so many people needing to use our emergency services, our emergency rooms in hospitals, and our ambulance services, and working to reduce illness rates in the first place. We must go beyond just finding the money to deal with the problem to finding the money to prevent the problems in the first place. And these are common headlines that we see in the UK every year. Ambulance waiting times. Every winter, ambulance waiting times escalate. Our emergency rooms become overcrowded. The waits in emergency rooms are incredibly long. The media report all of these winter beds crises every year. And yet, a crisis that happens every year, is that something that we should be accepting? What is it that we're doing to prevent those crises from happening in the first place? And to address that, we need to think in a long-term and integrated way. We aren't there yet, and the media does not help with this kind of disconnected mindset. We're often so fed into issues, and we think about issues in a single-track way. So every time we see that these ambulance targets aren't met, and we're told about the horrors of patients waiting for hours on end for treatment, there ensues calls for extra investment into our healthcare system. We're told that if we're just to throw more money at the issue, then the issue will go away. And think how often you see a government respond to a crisis in the press by saying, we've increased the budget for X by 50%, or we've committed an extra £50 million to Y or Z. But what is this money really doing? Is it enough? Is it just spending in the here and now to patch up a system which at its very core is failing? How is it helping to prevent this issue happening again next winter and next winter and next winter? So we need a conscious shift in our thinking to join up the dots for our policymakers and for wider communities to understand the importance of this too. Because these issues actually are all connected back to other issues. So when we set targets about how long it's taken for an ambulance to turn up, how long you're on a waiting list for a hip replacement, how satisfied are you with the quality of your 10-minute doctor's appointment? Actually, a better question to ask is, how satisfied are you with the quality of your life? Because when we see this evidence from the World Health Organization about the things that actually make a difference to addressing health inequality, we see that only 10% of what makes a difference to addressing the gaps in life expectancy is anything to do with the healthcare system itself. 35% is about income security, whether you have enough money to put food on the table, whether you're living in poverty. 29% about your living conditions, the quality of your housing, whether you're living in areas of high air pollution, whether you have access to nature. 19%, the really soft and fluffy stuff, if you think about some of the challenges that the anti-welfare or well-being brigade levy. 19% of the direct correlation between life expectancy is to do with social and human capital, relationships. Do you have a sense of agency in your community? Does a sense of community even exist in the area that you live? So we must stop playing the £1 million crisis drop, which we do every winter and which we do across a range of other policy areas all of the time. We find the money, as we say in the UK, at the back of the sofa to deal with a crisis, and yet we can't find that money to stop the crisis emerging in the first place. So, if it's not in our nature to act in the interests of future generations, to think to the long term, to think in a preventative way, then we need a legal framework that transcends political cycles to make sure our decisions do take into account those yet to be born. And in Wales, we are the first country in the world to have that legal framework. The Wellbeing of Future Generations Act passed in our Senedd, our national parliament, in 2015. It does a number of things, but this is the overarching principle, that all 44 of our public institutions covered by our legislation, so our local authorities, our municipal governments, our health institutions, our public health agency, our environment agency, and significantly the Welsh Government itself, Welsh ministers themselves, must demonstrate how when they're taking decisions, they're seeking to ensure that they meet today's needs without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And the legislation also sets out 7 long-term national wellbeing goals. These goals were derived from a conversation with the citizens of Wales, where we posed the question, what is the Wales you want to leave behind to your children and your grandchildren and future generations to come? And they came up with a set of goals, a set of aspirations for the Wales that they wanted to leave behind. And at the same time, the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals were in development. So we brought those goals into our legislation, and these are the set of 7 long-term goals. Now, you wouldn't think it was revolutionary for a country to have a set of long-term goals, but it is. Actually, there's no other country in the world that has legislated in law, not just in some high-level policy document or aspirational manifesto, but set out in law that a set of well-being goals which our institutions are legally required to achieve. And beyond that, the legislation sets out 5 principles of governance, 5 ways of working that our public institutions, our politicians, must demonstrate that they are acting in accordance with when they're taking decisions. So recognising the long-term impact of the things that they do or don't do, and the long-term trends and scenarios that may impact on their decision. Preventing problems from occurring or from getting worse. Integrating their thinking, so recognising that everything's connected to everything. And actually we need to get beyond our departmental silos or our policy silos to recognise those connections and take action on them. Collaborating, working together across the public, private and third sector, recognising that no one sector or no one organisation can meet some of the big challenges we face on their own. And involving citizens. Walking in the shoes of the people who you are designing policy for, understanding the lived experiences of people, bringing people in to give their ideas and their solutions. And it also sets out an infrastructure, including a Future Generations Commissioner. My role is set out in law, is to act as the guardian of the interests of the future generations of Wales. No pressure. I've had a few sleepless nights about that job description, but we are making changes and we are making progress, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a moment. So my job is to both advise and support the government and these other institutions on how they achieve these 7 long-term wellbeing goals, but also to monitor and assess their progress, and if you like, to be the conscience of future generations, to sit on their shoulder and ask and question and challenge on behalf of those yet to be born as to how their interests have been considered in the way in which decisions are taken. We also need to recognise the connections between things. The beauty of our legislation is that it forces us not just to look at the connections between short-term and long-term, but also the interconnections between different areas. So we know, for example, that climate change is affecting our physical health, but current trends are also telling us that climate change is now a very real cause of mental health issues, especially in young people. And a 2020 survey of child psychiatrists in England highlighted that more than half, 57%, are seeing children and young people distressed about the climate crisis and the state of the environment. The mental health impacts of the climate crisis have profound implications. Psychological responses such as conflict avoidance, fear, helplessness and resignation are serious barriers to collective action to mitigate further global warming and to build resilience and adaptation strategies. And neglecting the effects of the increasing eco-anxiety risks, exacerbating health and social inequalities between those more or less vulnerable to these psychological impacts is a significant challenge. The socio-economic effects will add up considerably to the national costs of addressing the climate crisis. And so we must make the links between climate change and these issues. We must see the links between climate justice and the climate crisis and racial justice. this isn't just a connection. Climate change is inherently a racial justice issue in the UK and, of course, globally. Our actions as gas-guzzling nations affect those in the global south in ways we cannot even begin to understand. Now, this is Majuma, and this is her daughter, her little girl, Fatima. Now, Majuma from Uganda was married off at the age of 13. And the reason why she was married off at the age of 13 and had her little girl, Fatima, was because her father could no longer afford to feed her because the climate crisis had dried up the land and he could no longer grow crops to feed his family. So whilst we may think that we might understand the climate crisis in terms of how we see it in front of our eyes, actually it's affecting people on the other side of the world in these most horrific of ways. But it also happens, that climate and racial injustice issue, in our very own communities. And do we actually see that? In the UK, if you are from a black or ethnic minority community, you are far more likely to be living in areas of high air pollution. You are far less likely to have access to high quality green space. And so these things are intrinsically linked. And the climate emergency impacts more on the lives of vulnerable and marginalised communities as they struggle to recover financially in the aftermath of some of these big and challenging events. And that's where our institutions, again, must really see the connections. At the beginning of 2020, just before the pandemic hit, the South Wales Valleys, some of our poorest communities in Wales, were hit by horrendous storms and flooding. And many of those communities lost their homes. They were the sorts of communities who were choosing whether to buy household insurance or buy food, and of course they chose food. So when that emergency and that crisis then hits, they do not have the capacity to recover. And it's going to cost in excess of 100 million to put that infrastructure that was damaged right and to rebuild those lives. And yet, the public institutions who are responsible and will meet the bill of doing that in that area, it's the area, the public pension, where the public pension fund is investing the most in fossil fuels through its pension funds. So on the one hand, they're footing a bill for £100 million to deal with the effects of climate change, and on the other hand, they're investing their money, which causes the problem in the first place. And this is where we must see these interconnected problems and solutions. And of course, this is just one story here in Wales and in the other side of the world, of how the actions of a predominantly white global north are having profound and devastating consequences to people of colour in the global south. And it's why the goal that we have in Wales to be a globally responsible nation is so important. The first £1 million cheque for coal was signed in Cardiff, our capital city. The first £1 million cheque for coal of anywhere in the world. So we have a long history of industry and links to coal and carbon. And so therefore, arguably, we have a greater obligation to put right those wrongs of the past. And again, in other parts of the world, our actions are having a significant impact. So currently an area equivalent to 40% of the size of Wales is used overseas to grow commodities imported to Wales. It's time that we realise the impacts of this on our planet and the communities around the world. And we recently heard about the impact of Wales's procurement on deforestation and indigenous communities. And deforestation has meant that the ability for people to survive has become increasingly difficult, with rivers becoming polluted, traditional herbs no longer being found, and hunting made more difficult. And a few months ago, I was at COP26 in Glasgow, and I was privileged to meet this man, Chief Revelino Vera Gabriel, a Brazilian tribal chief who's at the front line of the impacts of deforestation in the Amazon. And he told me about the devastating impact soy farming was having on the Guarani indigenous people, how soya imports to my country, Wales, could be responsible not only for deforestation, but for indigenous blood. And following these discussions at COP26, Julie James, Wales's Minister for Climate Change, announced a commitment to change rules around public procurement. So schools and hospitals, for instance, have to make sure that the goods they buy in from abroad are deforestation free. What I'm illustrating here is that where decisions often seem black and white, they never are. Every decision that we make has knock-on effects, and it's our role to make those connections before we take action so we prevent these problems and issues arising in the future. So how do we legislate with all of this in mind? How do we make sure that decisions to alleviate risks and respond to long-term predictions so that we don't have these black swan events and we stave off the problems which might be coming our way? What our legislation requires us to do is to look for the well-being sweet spot. The wellbeing sweet spot is about making sure all policies are interconnected to meet holistically our 7 long-term wellbeing goals. It's the point where different policies, some that might seem unrelated, overlap and meet in the middle to reach true well-being. So take healthcare, for instance. Increasing the budget for mental health support in schools is an obvious policy to improve health and well-being. But what if that was paired with a universal basic income that allows the poorest in society to heat their homes in winter and free bus fares to reduce congestion and lower pollution in our communities? What about the buildings of safe bikes and active travel paths for the commute to work, or opening up more green areas in our city to create the right environment for good physical and mental health? And we can go further. Imagine if schools could only feed our children locally grown food, not only improving the community's economy, but giving our young people a great start in life with nutritious food without a carbon footprint. So wherever we start, we find that the answers often lie in the less obvious areas, and our systems of government, governance and public services need to make understanding and acting on those connections part of their DNA and part of the way that they operate. So encouraging active travel lowers pollution and gets people moving, helps us perhaps to address the long-term obesity crisis that we face in the Western world. A universal basic income tackles poverty, which is a massive, as we saw, determinant of the health of our nation. A national wellness system, shifting healthcare to a preventative care system rather than just putting all of our money in dealing with acute issues once they've arisen. Decarbonisation of homes helps us to reduce fuel poverty, creates jobs in doing that decarbonisation, and helps to regenerate communities, take people out of fuel poverty and keep people out of hospital in the winter months. Green spaces within 300 metres of our home, good for physical and mental health, and helps us to address inequality relating to those communities who don't have that access. Upskilling for green jobs and reaching those furthest from the labour market helps us to meet our decarbonisation targets, tackle inequality and improve the physical and mental health of the nation. The wellbeing sweet spot is about turning away from the obvious or traditional solutions in favour of the creative. It isn't just about policies either. It's a spot where people meet for integrated and collaborative work from diverse backgrounds and schools of thought. I like to say we need to bring the unusual suspects together. Often policy is derived in ivory towers from people who think that they know best. But actually, we need to bring into our policy environment the creatives, the people who are going to challenge our thinking, the people who work with communities, the people who have lived experiences of the issues that we're trying to address, the people who understand tech, the people who understand the environment. One of my favourite examples is our National Museum working with local health boards to utilise our rich culture and history in Wales for the well-being of communities and to prevent mental health issues and loneliness. So where we see this legal obligation now in Wales forcing our institutions to work beyond their immediate remit of delivering culture and museum and heritage activities, to how can you use that to improve the health and well-being of people? So what's changed as a result of our legislation? One of the first biggest tests of the Future Generations Act were government plans to build a 13-mile stretch of motorway to deal with a problem of congestion at an area called Newport. And this is a kind of traditional approach. We've got a problem with congestion, the road's full, what do we do? we build another road. That's generally the answer that we see. The problem with that, however, is you build another road and we just fill that road. And all of the evidence suggests that you then have to build another road and another road and another road. And that's basically what we'd been doing in Wales. And as a consequence of that, our public transport was poor. All of the investment had gone into building roads, and the government wanted to do that again. And I intervened and I asked them to explain to me how, using the entire of their borrowing capacity, around £2 billion, to build a road was in line with our goal of a prosperous Wales, which talks about a productive, innovative, low-carbon society, which uses resources efficiently and proportionately, which acts on climate change. How it's in line with our goal of a resilient Wales, which talks about securing the ecological resilience of our nation. How it's in line with the goal of a healthier Wales, where we need to reduce air pollution, not add to it, and where we need to get people out of their cars and onto active travel and public transport in order to deal with these long-term issues around obesity and physical inactivity. How it's in line with the goal of a more equal Wales when 25% of the lowest income families in that region don't even have access to a car. So you'll be spending £2 billion for no benefit for those communities. How is that addressing inequality? And whilst it had been regarded to be a done deal, because we see across the world, whenever there's an argument between economy and environment, economy always wins. But in this case, environment won. The government, following that intervention, changed their mind, and this road building scheme was cancelled. Instead, we now have proposals for 6 new train stations and mass investment in public transport. And that's moved on. So I've worked with the government to challenge them further on how this is now going to be applied to the rest of our plans around transportation in Wales. We've reformed our transport strategy. We've put active travel at the top of our transport priorities and roads right at the bottom. We've announced a moratorium on all road building. All future road building is cancelled in Wales, subject to review in line with our carbon targets and our Future Generations Act. The Roads Review have reported on 2 schemes so far, both of which have been completely cancelled. A universal basic income, something which just a couple of years ago was seen as a pie-in-the-sky idea. How could we afford such a thing? My question to the government is, how can you not afford it? How can you afford not to do that? Because of these long-term impacts on poverty. And just a couple of weeks ago, the Welsh Government announced their first pilot of a universal basic income in Wales. A future-fit education system. How can we make sure that our school curriculum isn't just educating kids to go into another pointless job, but actually is educating them towards a life well lived? I like to call it, it's different to, we're quite competitive, England and Wales, and in England they've gone back to Latin. I like to say our school curriculum in Wales is less Latin and more life. And it's built around some key principles. The key outcomes that we're securing for our kids in Wales are to be healthy, active and confident learners, creative and enterprising individuals, and ethical and informed citizens. And we're doing away with knowledge. We Google knowledge. We're focusing towards skills. How do we give our kids the skills that they will need for the future? Skills around emotional intelligence, cooperation, teamwork, empathy, critical thinking. Our curriculum is built around these skills for the future. It's been piloted, it's been trialled, and this September in Wales will be rolled out to every school. When does an approach to reducing waste also happen to tackle loneliness and isolation? Wales as a nation is second in the world to Germany, actually, on our rates of recycling. But we are going beyond that towards zero waste. So we have aspirations to be an entirely zero waste nation by 2050. That's good. But actually, what's more interesting about our waste strategy is that what we've recognised is the way in which we go about getting to zero waste can also have multiple benefits and impacts. So what we've recognised is that if we do things like set up community repair cafes, community what are called libraries of things, so you can borrow a lawnmower from your local library rather than having to buy one and keep one in your shed or your garage. You can get your mobile phone repaired instead of having to buy a new one. You can get your clothes repaired at a community cafe. And when you do that, you're also interacting with your community. Perhaps if you're lonely and isolated, which is really bad for your health, you're making those connections with your community. So we're reducing waste whilst also improving well-being. And similarly, when culture pays health dividends, I talked about the way in which our museums are now working, but also our hospitals have art galleries in them. They are working with people, with creative and cultural professionals, to use the power of culture and creativity to improve health and well-being. I want to talk now, move on, after I've talked about some of our successes, to the final topic, which is about our consumerist lifestyles and how that is having an impact on the earth. So for too long, we've overlooked the World Bank. And I'm not talking about that World Bank. I'm talking about the actual World Bank. Our economic model might cause you to think of that other World Bank, but I'm talking about our bank of assets, all of the resources upon which the well-being of people and planet depend, resources of life. And realistically, we're using resources at a much faster rate than we can replenish them. In fact, our ecological footprint is equivalent to using about 1.7 times the Earth's resources. So we're running our planet on overtime. The ecological footprint for the whole world sits at this 1.7 planets, and that means that we're using resources as if we have almost 2 planets worth of resources to use, and we're passing that debt on to future generations. So if we put that into kind of like financial terms, that's like always spending 170% of your wages. And going further and further into debt. And that debt, of course, we are passing on to the next generation and the next and the next. But of course, with our World Bank, there's actually a finite amount of resources. So it means that essentially we're stealing from the future, borrowing more and more resources, but leaving little for future generations. Insisting that they deal with the problems that we're amassing. And this is due to the decisions that we make and what we do with our money. And I think that the missing piece of the puzzle, the piece that people can never think that we can never change really, is our economic model. In reality, shifting to a well-being economy is at the heart of all of the problems that we face and part of the solution to dealing with these problems. And that's why our statutory definition of prosperity in Wales is taking us in a completely different direction. So if I ask the average person on the street, what's the economy about? What's the purpose of the economy? What's the most important thing that we should be doing? I bet you'd get an answer about increasing GDP. Increasing economic growth. But this is our statutory definition in Wales. An innovative, productive and low-carbon society which recognises the limits of the global environment and therefore uses resources efficiently and proportionately, including acting on climate change, and which develops a skilled and well-educated population in an economy which generates wealth and provides employment opportunities, allowing people to take advantage of the wealth generated through securing decent work. Okay, it's not a very catchy definition of prosperity, but pick out those key words: productive, innovative, low-carbon, using resources efficiently, proportionally, acting on climate change, skills to enable you to access decent work, not just any old work, which may be bad for your health. And this isn't just set out in some aspirational policy document. This is the legal definition of the economy that we are seeking to achieve in Wales, and all policy flows from that. One of the biggest challenges that we faced is this entrenched idea in society that a healthy economy requires continuous growth and a continuous increase in GDP. For so long, our world has been infatuated with a growth mindset to the detriment of people and of planet. And we've been taught that whatever the question, the right answer is the one that makes the most money. We've come to accept somehow that a system that concentrates the same amount of wealth within the hands of the 63 richest people in the world as the poorest 3.6 billion is not just, okay, but it's essential. How have we found ourselves in a position where that is just regarded as the norm? So this, in my mind, is the elephant in the room, and it shows that a model of grow first and distribute later just does not work for people or indeed the planet. So what about donut economics? I don't know if any of you have seen the work of Kate Raworth. It's worth reading her book, Donut Economics. What she describes here is that actually, if you imagine a ring donut, with the outer, if we go beyond the ring of the donut, we're going beyond planetary boundaries. If we don't focus on in protecting people, they can fall through the middle of the donut. So the sweet spot, back to this sweet spot, is that ring of the donut. And all of our decisions, all of the things that we do, must ensure that we stay within that donut in order to protect the planet and to secure a future for our people. So we shouldn't be measuring success and development by growth and GDP, but by welfare and well-being. We need a system that puts the emphasis on a low-carbon, low-waste, regenerative and connected economy that works for everyone. And Kate Raworth explains that donut economics as the framework of well-being. The aim of the economic system should be to keep everyone in the safe zone. Here in the safe zone, in this sweet spot, people have decent work, they have good education and access to the things that keep people well. And bringing people out of poverty and into the safe zone is the priority, not economic growth for economic growth's sake. The safe zone is also about our environment, ensuring that our lives here on planet do not put the planet in danger. This means making economic decisions that tackle climate change, not adding to the crisis. But at the moment, this is where we are in terms of this donut. We've got lots in the red zone: biodiversity loss, climate change, big challenges in terms of gender inequality, big challenges in terms of energy, water and food essential to human life. So we're bypassing the economic and environmental boundaries. So this system of donut economics is about boundaries, not growth. This image of the donut shows us which boundaries we're currently overshooting and where we're failing short. And as you can see, we're way, way overshooting on climate change, biodiversity loss, and so on. But we're also failing when it comes to equality, education, and health. So it's about balancing the environmental impacts of our lives on Earth while ensuring that no one falls below the poverty line. Instead of having an endless goal of growth, it's about everyone consistently thriving. It takes the onus away from profit and monetary gain for the few and puts it on the well-being of the masses. We must realise that the way we've thought about money, and perhaps the very fact that often we've only thought about money, has left us with a mounting debt of challenges. This is life-changing, though, with nations around the world changing the way that they spend their money, putting the planet and people before profit. And here are some of the things that are starting to happen across the world. So in Australia, they don't have a chief economist, they have a chief circular economist. In Scotland, we have a minister for the circular economy. In Wales, we've got that Universal Basic Income pilot and a Future Generations Act and shorter working week trials. And of course, the great work being done here in Germany with the Circular Economy Act, going further than just waste management and promoting the circular economy in order to conserve natural resources and to ensure the protection of human health and the environment. And to come full circle back to the future as I work towards closing, I wanted to share with you some predictions from the past about how life might be. So by 1960, we'll be limited to a 3-hour working day. That would be quite nice. Actually, the working week has not changed in 100 years. Think about that. Think of all of the changes that have happened in terms of technology, in terms of technological advancements in the last 100 years, and yet we're still working a 36, 37-hour week. Is it time for us to be thinking about that differently? Is it time for us to be putting the well-being of people first rather than profits? Computers in the future may only have 1,000 vacuum tubes and perhaps weigh only 1.5 tons. Computers now are in our hands. Often they feel like they're surgically attached to our hands. And if we look at some of the predictions for the future, they won't be in our hands, they'll be in our retinas and beyond. Humans of the future will only have one toe. I'm not entirely sure where that came from. So this shows that you cannot predict the future. Of course you can. You can't. Nobody has got a crystal ball. But it is necessary for us to think about what may be coming. It is necessary for us to understand where we are here and now and actually how those future trends might play out and make sure that we are acting on them. So it's funny to see how far we've come in some aspects, such as technology, but in other ways, the people of the past were way ahead of their time. Maybe they'd be horrified to know that we're still staring at our work screens for 40 plus hours a week. And then if you look at some of these current predictions, predicted flooding in Cardiff, our capital city, predicted flooding in Hamburg. Due to climate change, up to 86 million Africans will be migrating their own countries by 2050. By 2050, 60% of males and 50% of females will be obese. 3 billion people will be homeless in 2050. Those are pretty bleak, but I think there's a moment of time for us to change that. So here are some of my predictions for the future, because we still have time to stop that dystopian future, but we must act now. And to do that, we need governments and governance to change their ways of working, because our current systems around the world are not fit for purpose if they're taking us towards those predictions. But there is this movement of change coming. So my prediction and my hope is that we will have a world committed to legislating to represent the interests of future generations and establish their rights and responsibilities towards them. Based on the model that we are operating in Wales as the first nation in the world, there is a private member's bill going through the UK Parliament. The Scottish Parliament is passing legislation. The Irish Foreign Minister has said that he wants legislation. Even the UAE have adopted some of the principles of our Future Generations Act. And we see that in other nations there are exciting things happening. The UAE Futureneers programme and 10 principles for the next 50 years. Iceland's successful 4-day working week pilot. Germany introduced a new initiative, well-being in Germany and what matters to us. Sweden's promise to look after all citizens, no matter whether they're rich or poor. France's post-COVID joie de vivre, getting people back to enjoying life, getting people and planet and the way in which we operate, not just to think about the importance of economic growth, but to think about a life well lived. And, you know, Europe is already doing some brilliant things. France has its own citizens' assembly for climate, putting community voices at the heart of decision-making. Norway has been using telemedicine networks since the 1990s for healthcare and welfare services. Germany have begun prescribing health apps to measure blood pressure, supporting physiotherapy or psychotherapy treatments and tracking diabetes. Iceland's 4-day week. Sweden has the highest carbon tax in the world, a carbon tax that was instituted in 1991 alongside an already existing energy tax, and it remains the cornerstone of Swedish climate change policy. Over time, the carbon tax has increased in importance, contributing to a broad range of environmental and climate objectives. For example, the carbon tax provides incentives to reduce energy consumption, improve energy efficiency, and increase the use of renewable energy alternatives. But we need to join up all of the dots and work together and learn from each other. And the UN, I think, are going to help us to join the dots, because just a few weeks ago, the United Nations Secretary-General announced in his Common Agenda paper that the UN will follow Wales's lead, will establish a Future Generations Special Envoy, a declaration on future generations, which is a UN equivalent of our Future Generations Act, reforms to the Trusteeship Council, the governance mechanism in the UN to embed the concept of accounting for future generations. And this could be a real game changer. Last week I joined the UN to present on the work that we're doing here in Wales, and imagine if every one of the 190 countries who are members of the UN adopted a similar framework. Could be an absolute game changer, the Future Generations agenda on a global scale. And that, I think, is what is absolutely necessary if our next generations are to have the futures that I think we all want from them. So Einstein once said that great spirits have always encountered violent opposition from mediocre minds. But I don't think we need any particularly great minds. We need common sense systems and common sense decision making. We need all of us in this room and all of our politicians in every parliament in the world to commit to being good ancestors and to take the brave and necessary actions to ensure that for future generations, this generation will leave the world better than they found it. Thank you very much.
Herzlichen Dank, Sophie Howe. Wir sollen alle gute Vorfahren gewesen sein, dann to be better ancestors. Jetzt geht's zur Diskussion. Bitte nehmen Sie Platz. Und wir haben auch eine Übersetzerin dabei. Thank you very much. Eine Frage vorweg. Es ist ja eine Zwickmühle, in der sie steckt, sowohl zur Regierung zu gehören und andererseits aber kritisch auf die Projekte zu schauen. Ich frage Sie direkt. Okay. In your position as the world's first minister of the unborn, you are quite in a difficult situation. While in the same time you are a minister and you have to be critical and independent. How do you manage it, and which was the biggest challenge in this?
Well, The Guardian have actually got that wrong, because I'm not a minister. They describe me as the world's first minister of the unborn, but I'm not part of government. I am independent of government, and that is the critically important thing.
Also es gibt einen kleinen Fehler bei der Guardian-Berichterstattung. Das funktioniert? Ich bin nicht tatsächlich Ministerin, sondern ich bin unabhängig. Also ich bin Kommissarin für die künftigen Generationen.
But you are paid from your government.
Paid from the government, independent of the government. Sometimes that can be a challenge, and I often get into arguments with the government about funding. But I think if you look at the news coverage in Wales, it will tell you that funding challenges have not stopped me calling the government out when they get things wrong.
Okay, also ich werde von der Regierung bezahlt, aber ich bin unabhängig von der Regierung. Das bedeutet, dass ich natürlich manchmal in die Zwickmühle gerate, aber ich, ja.
Gibt es Fragen hier im Publikum oder im Chat an die Kommissarin für zukünftige Generationen? Herr Kienle.
Yeah, thanks for your conclusions. One question. So, as you're a commissioner, you have to safeguard and give a guarantee for these 7 well-being goals. All this is hard stuff, I guess, only to find a compromise or a principle which is more important than the others. They are all important, but what is your track you want to follow? And the next question is, what practical approach do you have above conviction, above intervening in political process, but what legal remedies do you have? What are your instruments to enforce, for example, this example you gave to review road repair projects? What is your practical approach? Do you have funds? Is there a budget for your work, and how high is your budget? So the legal remedies, the enforcement instruments, and the budget, please.
Okay, so let's start with the sort of legal remedies and enforcement. So I can't compel anyone to do anything. I can't force them to do anything, and I can't stop them doing anything. Sorry.
Fangen wir mal mit den gesetzlichen Mitteln an, die ich habe. Also ich kann niemanden dazu zwingen, etwas zu verändern. Und ja, das ist die Vorgabe.
Decisions which potentially contravene the requirements of the law could be judicially reviewed. That's not yet been fully tested in the courts.
Also es ist so, dass wenn etwas möglicherweise nicht rechtmäßig ist, dass dann auch ich einschreiten kann und dort Gesetze halt nochmal prüfen kann. Ja.
I would say that really my powers are powers to name and shame and embarrass organisations and politicians who claim to want to listen to the views and experiences of young people and the policies that young people want to take forward, but don't always do that. And there isn't anyone who's speaking really on behalf of those young people as part of a system of governance. So that's part of my role.
Also in erster Linie kann ich Menschen halt benennen oder Organisationen benennen, die sich nicht korrekt verhalten, und dadurch, das ist hauptsächlich meine Aufgabe in der Regierung, und dadurch gebe ich halt der jungen Generation eine Stimme.
And I have powers which are called Section 20 review powers. They give me powers to go into institutions who are required to cooperate with me. I can review things that they have done. And if I trigger those Section 20 review powers, the recommendations that I make on the basis of whatever I've found, the public institution, the government or others are required to publicly respond to them. And if they don't follow the recommendations that I've made, then they're required to set out the reasons why and what they're going to do instead.
Also ich habe gemäß Artikel 20 die Möglichkeit, Dinge zu überprüfen. Also ich kann in die Institutionen reingehen, ich kann dort schauen, ob wirklich die Vorgaben getroffen werden, und ansonsten kann ich halt Beschwerden einlegen.
And then just finally on the budget, I have a budget. It's about £1.8 million. It's nowhere near enough to do the job that needs doing, but I've been quite successful in terms of other institutions. So, for example, I have partnerships with universities who will help to research or work through particular issues that I'm making recommendations on. I have partnerships with lots of organisations who do similar. I think the main point... Sorry, do you want me to stop there? Go on. Sorry.
Okay. Also ich habe ein gewisses Budget, das waren 1,8 Milliarden Euro, 1,8 Millionen Euro, und das erlaubt mir natürlich, einige Dinge anzustoßen, aber hauptsächlich geht es darum, dass ich auch netzwerken kann. Also ich kann in Institutionen reingehen und ich arbeite viel mit anderen Organisationen zusammen.
I think the most important thing about the legislation, and yes, maybe there should be more powers of enforcement, but it provides a framework for people within the system to challenge a system that's broken. And across Wales, what we are now seeing is people using the framework of the Future Generations Act to take completely different decisions than would have been taken before. This is about cultural change and building a movement of people doing different and better things.
Also es geht hauptsächlich darum, dass halt eine Kultur aufgebaut wird, dass Dinge anders getan werden, dass andere Herangehensweisen gewählt werden. Und das ist die Hauptmöglichkeit, wie ich Dinge verändern kann.
Thanks a lot. Die Frage zu Wahlrecht ab Geburt, das könnte ja auch passen. You say we colonize the future. But what do you think about the concept to grant children the right to vote upon birth, executed by their parents until they are adult? What kind of change would this bring in politics?
Well, in Wales, we've lowered the voting age to 16. That's a reasonable start. Parents voting on behalf of their children could be an interesting concept. That would be assuming that parents voted beyond even their prejudices and their immediate interests. So sometimes, sorry, go on.
Also, ja, das Wahlrecht ab der Geburt, das ist ein interessantes Konzept. In Wales haben wir das Wahlrecht so weit gesenkt, dass Personen ab 16 wählen können. Und das ist natürlich auch interessant für Ältere, weil sie möglicherweise dann auch über ihre Vorurteile hinweggehen und vielleicht eher im Sinne der jüngeren Generation wählen würden.
The challenge I think that we often have is you set out some principles, those 7 well-being goals, nothing that really you can disagree with. People themselves came up with those principles. However, a live issue at the moment in Wales, you want to cancel the road that was planned for a particular community to bypass cars from their area, and nobody wants that road to be cancelled. So this is about... Yeah.
Also es gibt also diese 7 Ziele des Wohlergehens oder des Wohlbefindens und damit sind alle einverstanden. Es geht dann allerdings darum, wenn wirklich eine Straße dann nicht gebaut werden soll, dass dann die Menschen plötzlich aufschreien und dann doch keiner mehr glücklich damit ist.
So this is not a silver bullet. This is part of setting a legal framework for doing different things, but it's not without its challenges.
Also keine Lösung, die für alle gilt. Es geht darum, dass man halt einfach einen gesetzlichen Rahmen schafft und so vorankommt.
Der Slogan heißt ja, lieber verzichten und wiederverwenden als recyceln. One of your slogans I saw is refusing and reusing is better than recycling. How you manage it in Wales?
Well, that's part of what our waste strategy is trying to do. So things like the library of things, so how that works practically is in communities, you can borrow things that you would otherwise be buying. So that's refusing. So you might have one lawnmower in a community rather than every 200 households having their own lawnmower. So that's refusing.
Das ist eine von den Dingen, die wir in Wales erreichen wollen. Wir wollen erreichen, dass Leute halt nicht so viel kaufen. Daher gibt es etwas, was sich Library of Things nennt, also dass eine Bücherei alle möglichen anderen Dinge des täglichen Gebrauchs auch ausleiht, sodass man zum Beispiel nicht einen Rasenmäher für die nicht einen Rasenmäher pro Person hat oder pro Familie hat, sondern die gesamte Familie halt sich einen Rasenmäher dann teilen würde.
And then on reusing, for example, our schools have school uniform swap shops. So school uniform gets reused from when the children grow out of their school uniform, the next age group and that is a way of reusing, but also tackling poverty, because poorer parents are able to have that, well, all parents, but including poor parents, are able to have that for free.
Also wenn es um die Wiederverwertung geht, gibt es zum Beispiel die Möglichkeit bei den Schulen, die bei den Schuluniformen einen Tausch machen, sodass man die Schuluniform halt hinbringen kann und andere Kinder, jüngere Kinder, die weiterverwerten können. Und das trägt auch dazu bei, dass die Armut halt reduziert wird.
Wir haben Fragen aus dem Chat. Our audience has questions.
So the first question is, are you in charge of future generations of Wales or of future generations of all countries?
Just Wales.
Ob die Verantwortung sich nur auf Wales bezieht oder ob sich die Verantwortung auf die zukünftigen Generationen in allen Ländern bezieht. Und die Antwort ist ganz klar, das ist nur Wales.
Eine Frage aus dem Publikum? Gibt es noch mehr im Chat auch? Okay. Danke.
Ich möchte gerne in Deutsch die Frage stellen. Ich fand es sehr interessant zu sehen, dass die Ministerinnen in den unterschiedlichen Ländern, dass es Frauen waren. Insgesamt scheint es so zu sein, dass Frauen die Themen offener annehmen. Meine Frage, wie bringen wir es an die jetzige Politikergeneration, diese Thematik heran, die ja eher älter und männlich im Schwerpunkt ist?
I found it interesting that most of the ministers that you showed in your presentation were female. So the question is, how do we manage to get those questions to male politicians or male and possibly older politicians who would be dominant in very many countries?
It's a really good observation, and I think you're right that if you look at some of the leading politicians around well-being economics and acting in the interests of future generations, Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand and Sana in Finland, maybe there is something intrinsically in the minds of women that are more connected to how do we protect our children and our future generations.
Beobachtung ist es tatsächlich so, dass in vielen Ländern gerade die Frauen politisch an den Positionen sind. Und möglicherweise ist es etwas, was halt in der Natur der Frauen in gewisser Weise liegt, dass sie halt ein stärkeres Bewusstsein, Interesse dafür haben, wie zukünftige Generationen leben würden.
But in Wales, it was a female politician who conceived the idea initially, and then male politicians who took the legislation through, and a male First Minister who is been responsible for taking some of the very difficult decisions that have been taken in Wales in line with the legislation.
Und in Wales war es tatsächlich eine Politikerin, die dieses Gesetz zuerst sich ausgedacht hat, die es dann weitergebracht hat an eine Reihe von männlichen Politikern, und im Endeffekt hat es der männliche Premierminister von Wales tatsächlich aus der Taufe gehoben.
Ja, thank you a lot. You see some more questions. Gibt's noch viele?
Two. So the first one, he asked, I understood that there is a pilot trial to spend money on state-paid income. Can you tell more about it?
So this is a pilot of a. It was started off as a universal basic income. It's less of the universal and more of a basic income because the pilot in Wales will target initially young people who are leaving the care system. So 500 young people leaving the care system in Wales will be paid, I think it's around £1,000 a month. And we will then model what the benefits to their well-being, their health and so on are for a period of 2 years.
Okay, also die Frage war nach dem bedingungslosen Grundeinkommen. Es gibt also in Wales eine Studie und dort wird aber nicht so sehr das bedingungslose Grundeinkommen studiert. Es ist eine Pilotstudie, sondern es geht darum, dass halt 1000 junge Menschen, die aus einem Fürsorgesystem gekommen sind, für einen gewissen Zeitraum dieses Geld zur Verfügung bekommen, bedingungslos, um zu schauen, wie die sich halt gesellschaftlich dann zurechtfinden.
So the next question is, you regret that money is rather spent on addressing existing problems than preventing them in the first place. Do you have examples from other countries showing that preventing problems is not more expensive than only reacting to them?
Well, there is a huge amount of evidence, particularly in terms of health, which, for example, will tell us that the biggest return on your investment that you can possibly get is investing in the first 1,000 days of life, so from pregnancy to a child's second birthday.
Also die Frage war danach, ob es auch international weitere Studien gibt, wo gezeigt wird, dass es mehr Return, also mehr Rendite quasi bringt, wenn man halt Geld in die Vorsorge steckt, als halt in die Behebung von den Problemen. Und die Antwort ist, dass es sehr viele Studien gibt, dass es sehr viel Evidenz gibt. Zum Beispiel, dass es einen unglaublichen Gewinn gibt, wenn man in die ersten 1000 Tage eines neugeborenen Kindes Geld investiert und dass sich das auf falsch lebenslang auswirken wird.
And if the person who asked the question would like to read some of that evidence, I would recommend the work of Michael Marmot on the wider determinants of health.
Und wenn es weiteres Interesse daran gibt, etwas darüber zu lesen, dann würde ich empfehlen, die Arbeit von Michael Marmot über Evidence of Health, also die Determinanten der Gesundheit.
Es gibt noch eine Frage im Saal, glaube ich. Und dann. Oh, it's okay. Wir kommen dann auch.
With regard to the local agendas, setting the diversity management system here, I remember that one question came up that is it important to have a master plan? So are you the mastermind? Do you have a master plan for Wales, knowing what level could be achieved and when are you satisfied in order to qualify what are the 7 well-being goals when they are achieved, or what is achievement in the next 20, 30 years for that goal?
So I'll give you the full answer to that. So at a local level, the legislation requires each area to set their own well-being plan, and that's a collection of all of the key agencies, health, police, local authority, environment agency, to set a collective plan for their area, and they are required for that plan to maximise the contribution to each of the 7 well-being goals.
Also auf einer lokalen Ebene gibt es die Vorgabe an die Regierungen und an alle dort Tätigen, auch Polizei, zum Beispiel Gesundheitssystem und so weiter, dass sie die Vorgaben dieser 7 Ziele einhalten, und das wird überwacht.
And then at a national level, there are 46 national indicators which track the progress across each of the 7 well-being goals. They are not perfect because it's very difficult to find perfect indicators, but they give us a means of assessing the progress that's being made.
Und auf nationaler Ebene gibt es 46 weitere Indikatoren, mithilfe derer überwacht wird, ob diese 7 Ziele auch auf der lokalen oder regionalen Ebene eingehalten werden. Das ist nicht perfekt, aber es funktioniert. Es gibt einen Überblick darüber, wie es funktioniert.
And then finally, from my perspective, each commissioner must every 5 years publish something called a Future Generations report, and that is my assessment of the progress that has been made across Wales. And it is, I'll pause. Yeah.
Und alle 5 Jahre muss ich als Kommissarin einen Bericht veröffentlichen, in dem halt dargelegt wird, wie sich diese Entwicklung vollzieht.
And that report has to be published a year before the next parliamentary elections because it's intended to, its recommendations are intended to influence the manifestos of political parties for the election. Our election,
Und dieser Bericht muss ein Jahr veröffentlicht werden, bevor die nächsten Parlamentswahlen stattfinden, sodass sie in diese Wahlen einfließen können.
Our elections were last year, so I published my Future Generations report last year, and I made hundreds of recommendations to political parties and government and others, and in our programme, in the government's programme for government now, just over 50% of the recommendations that I've made feature in the programme for government, which is the policy programme for this term.
Unsere Parlamentswahlen waren vor einem Jahr. Ich habe also auch meinen Bericht vor einem Jahr ungefähr veröffentlicht und ich habe Hunderte von Empfehlungen abgegeben und etwa 50% dieser Empfehlungen sind tatsächlich in ja in die Vorhaben der Regierung eingeflossen.
Letzte Chance für Ihre Fragen. Wir kommen dann langsam zum Ende. Ist ja auch es gibt nochmal so einen Slogan, den Planeten und die Menschen vor den Profit zu stellen. Putting planet and people before profit. It's one of your goals. How can we promote it personally as individuals? Or is it better to go in politics directly?
Of course, there are things that can be done as individuals. It's about questioning where you buy things from, whether you need to buy things in the first place. It's about reducing the energy we consume. It's about taking the bus or cycling rather than using our cars and so on. But
natürlich können wir auch selber etwas tun. Es geht zum Beispiel darum, was wir kaufen, wie viel Energie wir nutzen und wie wir uns fortbewegen, ob wir zum Beispiel den Bus oder öffentliche Verkehrsmittel nehmen.
But more importantly is about what you demand from your politicians, because yes, our personal contributions all add up, but it is the role of government and politicians to ensure that the way they are spending your money is not adding to the problem, that they are creating an environment that enables you to make the right choices, and that they are acting in the interests of future generations. So it's important that that is the most important thing, and sometimes politicians want to put all of the responsibility on you and not enough responsibility on themselves.
Aber natürlich ist es sehr, sehr wichtig, dass die Regierungen handeln, denn egal was wir machen, also ist es die Aufgabe von den Regierungen und nur sie können tatsächlich in einer Art tätig werden, dass es halt zukunftsbringend ist. Und gerne machen es auch Politiker so, dass sie einfach die Verantwortung dann wieder abwälzen auf die Bürger und das ist nicht der Sinn der Sache.
I have a question. Do you prefer to work in Ireland or in England, and why?
For the next law, yeah. Well, I want all parts of the UK to have a future generations approach, but actually I want all parts of the world to have a future generations approach. I finish my term of office next year, and that will be my ideal next job, trying to advise other governments across the world on how they can adopt a future generations approach.
Also natürlich bin ich dafür, dass es halt Gesetzgebung für künftige Generationen auf der ganzen Welt gibt. Das ist sehr wichtig, nicht nur im Vereinigten Königreich. Und ich beende meine Amtszeit nächstes Jahr. Und das ist eine von meinen Gedanken für die Zukunft, dass ich das auch in die ganze Welt tragen werde.
Fast ein Schlusswort. Sie erlauben vielleicht noch eine letzte persönliche Frage, last personal question. Mit all dieser Arbeit und dann 5 Kinder, wie kriegt man das zusammen? Es war ja auch Thema Familie, Arbeit. How you manage it, all these jobs and the politics and this engagement and 5 children?
Well, I guess it means I've got a real personal interest as well as a professional interest in the work that I do, and my children are my conscience as to whether I'm, doing enough and talking about the right things to politicians and others. Sorry.
Also ich habe ein sehr, sehr großes persönliches Interesse auch daran, diese Arbeit zu machen. Ansonsten ginge das auch gar nicht. Und ja, deswegen ist es mir so ein Anliegen, das in die Welt zu tragen.
But I think that, sometimes juggling can be challenging, but I think I would say never underestimate the power and the passion of a busy woman, and never underestimate the power and the passion of small nations to get things done and to change the rest of the world.
Also es ist natürlich oftmals eine Herausforderung, das zu jonglieren, 5 Kinder und die ganze Arbeit, aber unterschätzen Sie niemals die Kraft einer Frau, die wirklich ganz viel schaffen will.
Voller Leidenschaft und auch einer kleinen Nation, welche Kraft da drin steckt. Ne?
Ja, genau.
Ganz herzlichen Dank Ihnen als Übersetzerin. Sagen Sie bitte nochmal Ihren Namen für alle.
Ja, Anke Zeppenfeld.
Ganz herzlichen Dank Ihnen for the translation. And thank you very, very much. Sophie Howe, erste Kommissarin für zukünftige Generationen. Wir werden vielleicht noch von ihr hören und wer weiß, vielleicht kommt es ja dann auch nach Deutschland. We hope maybe you come to Germany with these ideas. And thank you very much for coming. Ihnen herzlichen Dank für die Aufmerksamkeit, die Geduld und Ihre Fragen hier im Saal und zu Hause oder am Smartphone. Und herzlichen Dank auch für diese Denkanstöße, die 15. Ulmer Denkanstöße der Sparda Bank der Stadt und der Universität Ulm. Und Ihnen ganz herzlichen Dank, Frau Professor Bräuninger. Kommen Sie gut heim mit vielen schönen Gedanken und guten Gedanken. Danke.